Next on the program, Debbie Kelly, who you have met and heard from. She is a horticultural extension field specialist located in Franklin County. Debbie has a background in specialty crops and so forth, as well as a background in horticulture and all things commercial and gardening. Very frequent question that's encountered by extension people is, what's wrong with my plants? That's a tall order to answer, but undaunted, Debbie is going to give us her views on how to diagnose what is wrong with my plants. Debbie?
So I always enjoy coming in front of Master Gardeners, and you guys are so wonderful with your questions and your thoughts, and the volunteering that you guys do is just amazing. So I appreciate working with you all in my own county and chapter, but across the state as well. And I've been delighted to be here all day with you. I'm a big Mizzou fan, and the football game is on, and we're winning 31-27 with 6 minutes left. So I'm going to try to put that out of my mind. I want to give credit also to Katie Kamler. A lot of this, the pictures that you're going to see are things that she has done. I've added some things and adapted it, but I also want to give her credit for this as well. So when we're looking at what's wrong with my plants, we get that all the time into our county offices. And what's best is for us to see pictures, close-up pictures, as well as a little bit of a distance of a picture. Like you see the tree on the right, we can actually see the full tree. And then with the picture, that's the second one from the left, we see the leaves that are there up close. And then the picture on the left with the tomatoes, we see the top of the tomato as well as we see the bottom of the tomato. So all of that is very, very helpful when we're looking at plants that are brought into our office or pictures that are sent to us. So we love, it's a mystery. We're like CSI trying to investigate. So let's get started. I'm going to do a little bit of a review. So what we really wanted to do is decipher if the issue that you're having with your plant is really caused from an insect, a disease, or is it really an environmental cause? And so we'll go over that real briefly here, and then we'll look at a bunch of pictures, and I'll ask you to put in the chat box what you think the problem might be. And then we're also going to look at who is it that you can contact for additional information. So I'll put some information up about that as well. So first, let's look at insects. We know that insects, predominantly how they cause damage to our plants is really going to be according to the kind of mouth parts that they've got. So we have chewing, piercing, sucking, siphoning, and sponging. And you can see on those diagrams on the right side how the shape of those mouths are totally different, so that we can actually then understand that the damage that we see from the plant really is going according to the kind of mouth part that it might have. So let's really look at the chewing mouth part, because that's the one that's going to cause a lot of the damage to plants. So they actually are going to bite something, or they're going to grab it and kind of rasp it off. And then they're actually going to chew the external part of the plant. You'll see holes, missing leaves, window panes, scraped areas. That's a true indication that the problem with your plant is probably going to be from an insect with the chewing mouth part. Most of those insects are going to be beetles, caterpillars, which are really important for us to understand, bees to a little extent, but not as bad, grasshoppers, wasps are kind of like in that bee category where, yeah, they have that kind of a mouth part, but they really don't go after the plants. Those are mainly going to be more of our pollinators. When they chew off portions of the plant, they will weaken the plant. They'll cause the plant to be less productive. They'll still thrive. Or if you have an infestation, they'll really go after that plant. The plants then might actually lose enough of their leaves that they're not able to produce enough chlorophyll, photosynthesize, and be able to actually keep that plant producing well. The other mouth part that we really want to take notice of is those insects that have a piercing and sucking type of a mouth. They're actually going to feed on the sap. So what they're going to do is they're going to insert that mouth part into the plant, and then they're going to suck that sap, that liquid out of that plant, and that's what they're going to feed on. So this type of damage is going to be spotting. The leaves may be distorted, whether they're going to be curled up or they're going to be misshapen. They may look a little bit different in color, chlorotic, where they're a little yellow. There might be some wilting of that plant as well, because they're taking out those nutrients that the plant might need, or they're taking out the moisture that the plant might need. Typical insects that have this kind of a mouthpart are going to be the aphids, scales, what Tamara talked about earlier, true bugs, leaf hoppers, thrips, and mites. They will also weaken the plant where they'll be less productive as a plant, or if there's an infestation, they could have the tendency to die as well. When we're looking at the insects, also knowing if it's a complete metamorphosis or incomplete metamorphosis. So if it is a complete metamorphosis, like on the left, we'll have the egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And the portion of the insect, the phase of its growth that's really going to be the most important for us to pay attention to is actually the larva stage, where they're a caterpillar. That is going to have the chewing mouth part. As a fertilized egg, it doesn't do damage. Caterpillar will. It goes into its stage where it's going to change into something else, and it will come out as either a moth, a butterfly. And that usually, when you see it at that stage, they're not going to do damage to the plant as we might think. So if you see them or this insect on any of your garden crops, this is not the stage where you actually need to be concerned about it, other than they may go ahead and lay eggs. So you do want to pay attention to that. When we're looking at the incomplete metamorphosis, that's where they grow, they hatch, they're little, and then they get bigger, but they look exactly the same. Most of these, no matter what stage they're going to be in, whether it's a nymph or an adult, is going to cause the damage to the plant. The other thing that's important when we talk about these two different categories of how they grow, either complete or incomplete, is that 85% of the insects that are going to have some sort of damage to our plants are going to have that complete metamorphosis. So it's going to be in that caterpillar stage. Then we're looking at the incomplete metamorphosis. Only about 15% of our pest insects are going to have that complete metamorphosis. So you want to be on the lookout for those caterpillars, of course. And that's your first clue there as to the type. If you see where the insect as a little young is going to be identical to the adult, there's not as many of those insects on our plants. Then we want to talk about diseases. As a real quick overview again. A disease is just a malfunction of the way the plant is growing because of an irritation that is occurring to it, whether that irritation comes from the environment or whether it comes from a pathogen. And a pathogen is going to be the virus, bacteria, nematodes, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but we have that disease triangle. So we have to make sure that we have the appropriate host that the disease, the pathogen wants to feed on or feed in or grow on or grow in. We want to make sure then they're going to actually have that specific pathogen. And then we have to have the appropriate environmental conditions that are favorable for the growth of that pathogen. So what if we, like this year, we had a very damp, really cool spring. So we had specific types of diseases. If we had a really nice, warm type of a spring with the appropriate type of moisture, we wouldn't have had the same diseases on our plants as what we had this year. So our diseases can kind of rotate a little bit depending upon the susceptible host, the pathogen that is present, and how the environment is, the growing environment that we're actually having for that particular weather year. The other thing we want to take account of is to determine if what's happening to our plants is it going to be something that's going to be environmental, or is it going to be something that's really caused by a pathogen? So If it's going to be a pathogen, meaning it's something that's going to be alive, something that's going to infect our plants, it's going to be biotic. Biotic means living. If it's something that is not living, it's going to be considered abiotic, which means it's a disorder, or it's some sort of a stress, which means the environment in some capacity is actually causing that particular issue on that plant. Whereas if it's living, then it's going to be the cause. So when we look at our plants, and then when we, as an individual plant, and then if we look at our plants in the setting itself, we can kind of look at it to determine the damage, the distress that we're seeing with our plants to kind of figure out if it's a disease or if it's a disorder or stress. So on the left side in the green box there, pretend that that's filled with plants and they're all the similar type of a plant. But if we only see the issue on a few of them spottingly throughout that particular growth or that particular area where the growth is occurring for those plants, that growing area, then it probably could be something that's going to be a pathogen. On the right side in that green box with all of those plants, if it's occurring on all of those plants more or less simultaneously, then chances are that it's going to be a disorder or a stress. It's going to be something that is not alive that's causing that plant to have that kind of an issue. Most folks automatically are going to think, oh, I've got a disease. The plant doesn't look right. It's a disease, when it may not be so. So you can look at the plant itself, where it might be on one section of the plant, whether it be on the inside of the plant, the outside, the top, the bottom, and then it slowly moves and progresses that disease through that plant itself. Or you can look at your rows of crops that you've got in your garden. For example, if you've got a bunch of tomatoes growing there, is it occurring in one tomato plant here and maybe one over there, and then it starts slowly spreading to the other tomato plants? Then chances are it's going to be a pathogen. If it occurs to the entire tomato plant, for example, all at one time, chances are it's some sort of a stress or disorder. Or if it happens to all the tomato plants in the garden at the same time, then again, it could be a distress or a disorder that occurs. So we look for signs and we look for symptoms also if we're trying to figure out if it's a pathogen or if it's a disorder or stress. We'll look at the signs. The signs are actually going to be visible structures. They're going to be pieces of or portions of something that we're actually going to see on the plant. So if it's going to be something with an insect, we might see the insect itself, or we'll see the frost. In other words, that's the polite way of saying insect poop. You might see mold. We might see spores that are growing and spreading across that particular plant. As a symptom, it's going to be the reaction of the plant according to whatever is happening to it. So it's going to be the leaf spots, the chlorotic appearance of the plant, stunting, stippling, wilting, the marginal chlorosis or necrosis that might be happening on the leaves, abnormal growth. And also we can look at the roots. If the roots are black or really, really dark brown instead of being white, that is also another indication as a symptom. And a lot of times people can get confused between signs and symptoms. So what I generally talk about is I have a sore throat. I go to the doctor. The doctor goes, I think you might have strep throat. Let me do a culture. So I have a reaction. My throat hurts. Where the sign is going to be when the doctor takes that culture and then takes it and looks at it underneath the microscope or whatever they do in that back room that we as patients never get to see, they're able to actually see the sign. They can actually see that particular strep throat structure, and that's what the sign is going to be. So the sore throat is going to be the symptom. The sign's actually going to be, they can see the strep throat. So that's the same way that we do that with plants. Do we actually see something there that indicates what the issue is? or are we seeing a symptom of what the issue could be that gives us a clue of what it could be? So we need to think about our plants in that train of thought as well. So here we can look at it visually, whether it's a sign or a symptom. So we're looking at bacteria wilt, and that's going to be the two pictures at the top. We can see a symptom. The leaf is wilted. So we know that it's on, if we look at it, it's just on a portion of that plant. It's not across the entire plant. We can see if we don't do anything with that might then spread to the next plant. And then that's also something for us to pay attention to. If we want to see a sign, we can actually take the stem of that cucurbit and actually cut it if we're suspicious of bacteria wilt. And then when we cut it, actually slowly pull that apart, and we can see the bacteria that's going to be moving back and forth between the stem where we actually cut it. That's going to be the sign. When we're looking at a canker on this tree branch here, we can see the canker, which is essentially another term for sore or a cut or a bruise, so to speak, on a plant. So we can see the canker where it's sunk in here, and this whole area is open. So that's our canker. The sign is actually going to be, we can see these orange specks. That's actually going to be the fruiting body of the issue of what's actually that pathogen that's actually occurring on our particular plant. When we look at diseases, we have a couple of different kinds. We have fungus, we have bacteria. So the fungus actually is the most common of all of our diseases. 70% of the diseases that occur with our plants are going to be a fungus. And so they're spread by plant debris, could be in the soil, wind can blow those little spores all over the place, water splash, seeds, insects, animals, people can actually spread the fungus. So when I look at something that's brought in or I see pictures, my first thought is going to be, oh, is it a fungus? And I'll kind of look in that category first. Then I might look, if I'm not seeing it as a fungus, then I'll look to see if it's a bacteria. Only 15% of our plant diseases are spread by the bacteria itself. So those are spread by infected plant material, soil, water splash, pruning tools, insects, and seeds. Other types of diseases that can occur are our viruses. Viruses are only 5% of the diseases that actually occur on our plants. They are spread by infected plants, grafting, sorry about that. Insects are one of the main causes of how viruses are spread. We also can spread it ourselves by touching plants, and if there's a bruise or an opening or a cut in another plant that doesn't have it, we get that virus on our hands, we can spread it. Viruses can come in on seeds as well, but only 5% of our plants are actually with a virus. Nematodes are parasitic unsegmented worms. Only about 10% of the different diseases are caused by parasites to the plants. We don't have that many when it comes to our horticulture crops. Pine wilt is actually one of them that we do take notice in our landscapes, and that is actually caused by a nematode as well. So disease control itself, if we're looking at that, the picture on the right, I like this because this gives us a picture of the full cell. We have the fungus, the size of the fungus in relationship to the actual cell. We have the bacteria, we have the virus, and then we have the nematode. So we can actually see how small these different types of pathogens are according to the size of a cell of a plant. The fungal diseases are easiest to control, and I don't really want to say, I'll say control, because diseases, we really don't have any type of fungicide that's going to kill the fungus. What a fungicide is going to do is be preventative, so we see it, we can spray for it, and that it helps to keep it under control so that it won't continue to spread across the plant or to other plants. It doesn't actually kill it. You can also use it, for example, if you've got fruit trees in your yard, some of our small fruit crops. What you might want to do is there's preventative schedules, especially with our fruit trees, and that will help the disease from actually trying to get started on the trees itself. It prevents it. Bacteria diseases are harder to control. There's very few chemicals for that, and they're not very effective. When it comes to our viral diseases, there's not any way that we can actually cure it once the crop or the plant is actually has the virus. The best thing for us to do is go ahead and pull that plant out so that it doesn't get transferred to another plant. So we have to know what those actually kind of look like. So what is wrong with my plant? So as I mentioned at the beginning, plants can't talk. Just like your infants and small children can't talk. So when you go to the pediatrician, you have to know what's happening with your child to be able to explain to the pediatrician what's been happening with them. So you need to know what is the plant that you have and be able to identify it as an accurate plant with the real name. If I say frog bellies, I know what I'm talking about, but most of you out there probably don't know. It's what I call it was the frog belly. That's the name I grew up with it, but it's actually a sedum, the purple flowering plants that we might be starting to see blooming right now. But we called it a frog belly. So we also have to know what plant we're talking about. You want to look at the plant to see if there's insects there. Do you see any signs of an insect, such as the insect itself? Do you see any eggs, larva or adult, any frost that you might see in or around or under the plant or on top of the soil? You also want to look around to see if there's anything that's spreading from one plant to another. Just take notice of that. Is the plant actually wilting because it's a mechanical injury? For example, someone might have walked past it and it was a fragile branch and it got broken or cracked a little bit, and maybe that tip of that branch then is wilting. We want to know how that plant is cared for. How often did you water the plant? How often, especially when we're talking at turf, we always have a lot of questions about turf issues. How high do you mow it? How often did you water? Did you fertilize? When did you plant those grass seeds? When did you plant the shrub or the bush? When did you prune it? A lot of those questions we have to ask of you so that we know what might be the cause of whatever's occurring with your plants. We like to know about the soil. What is, and a lot of times we may ask you to do a soil test. Is the pH off? There are some plants that prefer a lower pH, but most of our plants prefer that pH between a 6 and a 7. If your pH is too low, then really what you're seeing with your plants could be the fact that you don't have the appropriate nutrients in that soil. And it really isn't a disease. It's just a matter of not having the appropriate soil fertility. What about the weather? We had a couple of days this spring, late spring, about 2 or 3 nights in a row where we got down way below freezing. So after that, we saw a lot of damage to a lot of our plants outside in the environment. I know I had some damage on some of my plants. I didn't cover trees because of course they're bigger, but I did try to cover some of my delicate plants to try to protect them. So we need to think about, and so you may not have seen, you'll see the damage, but right away after it's cold, but then as the season grew along, perhaps that tree didn't grow out of it or that plant didn't grow out of it very well. And you may not have noticed it until months later. And then you call us or you try to figure it out. So you have to look back at the history of what occurred with that particular plant. And then what is the best way to handle the plant? A plant can be weakened by the environment, or it can be weakened by cultural practices that we actually might perform. And because of that, they could be more susceptible to insects and diseases. Yes, we know we have to prune, but we have to make sure that we prune at the appropriate time. that we prune carefully, that we clean our pruners between each cut to the next cut so that we don't transfer diseases from one plant to the next. So we need to be careful because we can easily transfer things or diseases from one to the next. Things we need to take into consideration. It's not uncommon for us to get a phone call and say, I've got this beautiful tree in my backyard. I've been living here for 50 years and it was big when I moved in. And now it looks like it's dying. And a lot of times we have to be careful because we have to be able to, inform our people that call us and go, we hate to really say this, but plants do have a lifespan, and they do have a tendency to die after a while. And if they have had issues during the growing season or over their lifespan, that can help them to have a much shorter life. Sometimes the problems that we see are cosmetic. They're really not going to do damage to the plant, but we get those questions as well. So we need to think about that. So we like to see pictures. A leaf gall or a gall on different branches of trees may also be one reason that we'll get a phone call or a picture, but it's really cosmetic. What is the value of that plant? Yeah, for example, that tree that was planted by grandpa and you're living in grandpa's house now, it's a beautiful tree. You don't want to lose it. It's sentimental. Do you really want to go ahead and do what you need to do to try to keep it alive? If that's the case, it's sentimental to you and you're able to do that, then that's okay. So there's lots of things to take into consideration when we look at what's really wrong with the plant and what is the best way to handle those plants. Tamara talked about this and showed this exact slide earlier about integrated pest management, where we try to figure out, we scout, we monitor, then we try to evaluate, see if what might be wrong with it. We try to prevent it from occurring or happening or spreading. And then we might want to take action against whatever is occurring. And we always say using pesticides is usually our insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, all of those types of things we say use as a last resort if it's needed. So we have different things. We can look at the cultural mechanical methods is what we want to look at. If Katie were on, she would say this is her favorite method of killing insects is to use masking tape and crawl and look underneath the bottom side of leaves, because that's a lot of times it's where eggs are going to be laid. And then she'll take that masking tape or duct tape and she'll just gather all those eggs, squish them, and then throw them away. We also want to try to have a lot of diversity across our garden area, if at all possible, because that helps to bring in those beneficial insects as well that might help to keep those bad insects from really overpopulating our garden. Choose plants for resistance to different diseases. Hose off your plants before you try to use any kind of insecticide. Some of those insects will actually wash off. Make sure you do and water your plants correctly. We try to say water your plants in the morning so that it has time to dry out throughout the day, because a lot of those different diseases need moisture in order for them to go ahead and start populating and growing and causing an issue. Pick those insects off. You've heard Tamara say that, and throw them in a soapy bucket. Remove any plant debris, especially now that we're putting the garden to bed. Any plant debris that's left over, if there's a disease, definitely carry it away. I have a tendency to get fungus on my coneflowers, and as soon as it's done blooming, I go out and try to cut that particular bloom off so that it doesn't continue to spread from one flower to the next flower. So I have to pay close attention to that. Use 3-year crop rotation. And like I just said, I prune infected parts of the plant off when possible. Allow beneficial insects to do their job. What you're seeing on the screen right now is the larva of the ladybugs. So those are good insects. So make sure you know what's a good insect and what's a bad insect. Be able to tolerate some of those pests. If my mom sees any kind of an insect, she wants to automatically spray no matter what. So I try to tell her that sometimes those are good insects to have. Again, lots of diversity. Draw those good insects to the gardens. You can purchase beneficial insects and release them in the gardens as well. And insectary plants is those beneficial plants that are going to attract your insects. Katie mentioned this in her presentation on weeds. Make sure you use the right type of a chemical for the right type of an issue that you're actually seeing. Remember that the label is the law. Then also follow those categories. And she had, I believe, had this down on her page as well. But follow what these different categories are. Know what these signal words are. And then know what the approximate amount could be that could actually cause true damage to different individuals and your pets as well. So be careful with them. So now we're going to look at some of these different types of pictures that I've got. Let me pull up my chat box here so that I can actually see it. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to put into the chat box, here is an issue that's occurred. We see that we have, it looks like marigolds growing. The front half of the marigolds look like they're growing really well. The back half are not. What do you guys think might be the issue with this particular plant? Why are they not growing in the back? What are some things that you might think could be occurring? Lack of sun, exactly. The back part of this looks like that there's probably not enough sunlight that's there for those particular plants to grow really, really well for what it needs to be very productive. So this is environmental. It's not a disease. It's just that there's too much shade. So what about this one? What do you think is causing this particular problem? And we're seeing window panes. This is what a window pane is going to cause or look like. They're between all those individual veins that we're actually seeing on the leaves. Okay, it's a caterpillar. There is a worm there. So this actually is a rose leaf. And this is actually going to be a rose sawfly that's actually causing the issue, or a rose slug. And so if you've got a bad infestation with this, then you're actually could potentially see your leaves, a lot of those leaves, the vast majority of them, if you don't catch them ahead of time, where could be totally devastating to your roses, but chances are those roses are going to outgrow that. Someone's put into the chat that they can't see the screen, but you can hear the audio. I'm having other folks that can actually see the screen and responding. So Sandra, you might want to log off and log back in and see if that might help. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure how to help you with that. Let's look at another picture. So most of you probably know what this issue is. So let's see. What do you all think is happening with this tomato here? Okay, blossom rot and root rot, too much water. So what do you think is the remedy of this with those different thoughts that are actually being put into the chat box? How would you correct this issue for the rest of the growing season? Lack of calcium. So as a master gardener, someone shows this to you, you're able to identify it, and then hopefully you'll be able to help them in what they can do. Exactly. Okay, so what the problem actually is, you guys are right on target with this, but we need to be a little bit more specific. So this is called blossom end rot. And you'll notice that here you can see the tomato is upside down on the bottom right, but you can see where it's attached to the plant. And then the bottom end of it, where we would call the blossom end, is actually rotting here. This is not a disease. It's actually because of inconsistent watering, which causes a lack of calcium uptake by the plant. So yes, it is true. We have an issue with calcium not being readily available for those plants to uptake, which is important for the growth of those tomatoes. However, you don't need to add calcium unless a soil test result tells you you need calcium. You may see a lot of things out on Facebook pages that say put in a Tums, put in eggshells when you plant your tomato plants. But in reality, those don't really help. What you really need to do is make sure that you provide consistent watering throughout the growing season. I know that we have a lot of rain that happens from time to time. And it happens, a lot, and then we don't have any, and then we have a lot and we don't have any. So what it really is that when we don't have any, make sure that you allow those soils to dry out, not completely, but dry, and then continue to make sure that you provide enough moisture on a week by week basis when there isn't any rain. So that will help. If you've got plenty of calcium in the soil, that will help you from preventing of getting blossom end rot. But if you continue to get that, you might want to do a soil test to actually see if you actually need calcium to be put into your soil when you fertilize. All right, so here's some more pictures. So there's 3 pictures. It's all the same type of an issue, but it can look a little bit different on different plants. So what do you all think might be the issue with these plants right here? Okay, we have herbicide damage, sucking insects, too much sun, nutrient deficiency. If that's webbing, then there's a spider mite. No, there really isn't. Too hot. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you the main issue of what you're seeing with this particular is herbicide damage or herbicide drift. You may not use herbicides in your lawn or your garden. But there could be maybe your neighbor, or if you're out in a rural community, maybe someone sprayed a field and there could be tiny, tiny particles that float on the wind that actually come down and might touch on some of your plants. This is a tomato plant, and we know that that's herbicide damage because the leaves are not looking very well. They look real curled. They look really, I always say, look really gnarly looking. And so the middle here, you can see the leaves are not growing really well. The blossoms are not developing well. And then in this particular plant, the type of herbicide damage they had, where it's actually yellowing of those leaves. So sometimes they will outgrow this. Sometimes they may not outgrow it. So curly leaves, actually what I mean by that is that they actually kind of cup upwards, or they could cup downwards. My fingers won't go the opposite direction. So they can cup upwards or pretend that so they could cup this way as well. And this is the top of the leaf. So they could cup, but a cupping type of a look could be one of the damages that actually occur from that herbicide damage. You might see speckles and specks on some of your plants as well. What damage might this be in? And this is one that Katie had. I was even stumped by this one. So if you all are stumped, you're right in line with me. Yep, I didn't know either. Something's eating on it. That was my first thought, but not really. Nope, no worms. You'll be surprised. Hail damage. So as these grapes were actually starting to develop, and this is what comes in with our questioning, what kind of weather, did you have any rain? Did you have, so we ask those questions, what actually has happened in the environment as well? So did it happen across all of the fruit on that particular grapevine? Do you have more than just one grapevine and it happened on all of those grapevines at one time? So if it happens all at once across all of those grapevines, or all of those fruit crops that might be growing in your garden are vegetable crops, and you see that damage scattered throughout the entire garden, then chances are it's environmental. So then you need to ask the question, what recently happened in the environment that I need to think about? So besides having just a picture, we also need to know the history of what's going on or what occurred with that plant. So did the hail damage happen during maturation or after fully made? It happened probably as those grapes were actually starting to grow and expand, as they're starting to fill out. And that's what's happening with this particular grapes. What's the damage here? Foreign object is right. So we have this metal pole, from this tree. And because of this metal pole being inserted into the tree, and who knows what the reason might have been, there might have been two trees next to each other and they put that pole in there and maybe put a swing, who knows, or they hung laundry, although it's awfully thick to hang laundry, but you never know. But the issue that's caused this browning is actually caused because there's mechanical injury to this particular tree. So mechanical injury is the correct answer there. What's happening with this particular plant? Someone says mites. Anybody else have any other thoughts or suggestions or agreement? It's spider mites. So actually, remember when we were looking at the insect section, depending upon the mouth part, will provide clues for us on the kind of damage that they do. So this is called stippling, where you see all of those little yellow dots. They're all across those leaves. And again, that's called stippling. And that is a true indication of spider mite damage. And so just keep that in your mind as far as that is concerned. So yeah, lots of things that might be occurring with these plants. It's just a matter of seeing them over and over again to fully understand what might be happening by looking at some of these pictures. So don't think you don't know anything, you probably do. As I was on campus and I was away from my horticulture knowledge for a number of years. I moved to this position with extension and started getting back into my horticulture knowledge. It was rusty, so it took me a couple of years to get back into knowing and recognizing all the different things that occur with horticulture. So if you don't know or don't remember, you're not alone. It happened to me as well. So what is this? Obviously, it's on a tree. What might this be? Kate says lichen. Anybody else? Fungus? It's actually a lichen. And so lichen does not cause any damage to our trees. They actually work symbiotically with our trees. And so if you see this, and we see this a lot out in nature, out in the woods, and it really doesn't cause any damage to our trees. They're, like I said, it's just symbiotic. So a lot of times we'll get pictures sent to us and go, what do I need to do? Do I need to scrape this off? You don't necessarily have to. They're perfectly fine leaving it on. What about this? Two different plant leaves, but look at the leaf itself. Any thoughts on what this might be? Leaf minor? What else? Well, first of all, we need to know, is this the normal growth for this particular plant? Are all of the leaves looking like this, or just a few of them looking like this? Do we have more plants in that same area? And is only one plant showing this where others aren't? So those are some things to think about. But actually what this is this is a virus. A virus has a tendency to make the plant grow in a fashion that is not typical or normal for that particular plant. So this leaf here is probably a solid leaf. And if you notice, all of these lines in here are not appropriate for this particular plant. And so we'll see discoloration and lines within that leaf. The picture on the right shows also line coloration that is there. So a lot of times we'll see the browning of this, or we'll see a browning and we'll see more browning in a circle shape going around that brown area that will also be brown. But here we're seeing the yellow circles going around, and then we'll see them bigger and wider and growing outward, so to speak. This is closer together. These are further apart. That is not typical for the growth of that particular plant. And so it's a virus. So remember, a virus spreads typically by insects. And so you definitely want to pull that particular plant out of your yard, out of your garden, totally dispose of it. And yes, this is probably a hosta on the left. What about this in your lawn? If you saw this, what would you think it was? grubs. What else? Dog spots, could be. Roundup, could be. Fungus, armyworms. Well, I was really surprised when I saw this too. And so a lot of things can look similar to other things, again, so that's why we have to ask a lot of questions. But it was mechanical injury. So what this actually happened at Katie's house in particular. There was a company that was working on, there were a company, utility company that was working there, and they had chainsaws or another type of small piece of equipment. The equipment was hot. They just set it down in the grass, and it was enough to actually burn the grass. The burn may not have shown up right away. It may have shown up later in the day or the next day. So we have to see and ask what actually might happen. So depending upon the type of issue, asking questions as to what happened there can help us to determine what might be the issue. So there could be other things. The armyworms are really bad this year for our turf. Is it a fungus? Could be, maybe not. But as I look at this particular picture on the right, it looks like there might be some weeds in this one. Whereas those leaves look a little bit different than these leaves. And usually a fungus is going to be particular on the plant itself. So it wouldn't be on both the turf as well as those broadleaf weeds right there. So that's an indication or a clue to ask those questions on what's going on. What's happening here? There's actually two things that are happening here. I knew one of them. The other one Katie had to tell me about. So don't feel bad if you don't know what they both are. Age, well, they could be wrinkled skin like I might have on my underarms here. Lots of wrinkles. Mulch too close to the plant. Caterpillar on one leaf. So we have to look to see if there's caterpillars. Something is eating it, so that is correct. So let's look. I'm sorry. So this is actually drought and Japanese beetle. So up here is the Japanese beetle damage. And then the brown leaf is actually drought. So again, we need to know when was that plant or that garden area received water? Did we water it? Was it really dry? And also remember, Katie talked about having mulch and mulching your gardens to prevent weeds. Mulch can also help to keep the moisture in the ground. But if there's not enough moisture, then the mulch is not going to help to keep that moisture. So even though we have mulch, we still have to water our crops as well. So you need to actually keep that in mind. And of course, the Japanese beetle, as we probably all in Missouri have seen that. What's happening here? They're all the same thing, even though they look different. Mold, nutrient, dog slime, fungus on dead wood, slime mold, harmless. You guys have more guesses on this one, so chances are you've probably seen it, right? So this is what we call dog vomit slime mold. So shortly after it actually occurs, you can it does look like, and if you've had pets and you've seen your dog vomit, you actually can see how it could be called this. And here it is a little bit drier. Here it might be even more dry. It is a type of a mold. It is a type of mold that actually feeds off of dead organic matter. So we have, it looks like wood chips and grass. We have wood chips, more wood chips over here. So those are our dead organic matter that mold is actually feeding off of, and it's not going to do any harm to our plants. What's going on here? Two different plants, same issue. One might be more developed than the other. Don't worry, I was stumped as well. Drought. So Barbara and Bob, you were correct. Water issues. Not sure which water issue you were thinking about, but this is actually drought. And so when we don't have a lot of rain, you start, and we actually have had this summer in certain portions of the state. I know especially in central Missouri, there has been some pretty heavy drought that happened there. Where I'm located, just south of St. Louis area, we've had a little bit of drought occurring. We were starting to see the leaves. Actually, I'm looking outside at my trees right now. I could see some of the leaves that were starting to turn a little yellow, turning brown, starting to fall off. And so that's a mechanism that trees and shrubs have to protect itself, because if it doesn't have enough moisture to provide that moisture to all of its leaf growth, what it does is it says, okay, some of you leaves, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to go, so that we can protect ourselves, so we can continue to thrive throughout the drought period. And if the drought then gets too bad, then the entire plant might have a real hard issue, like the picture that's on the right side. Anybody know what's going on here? Both the same thing. Really good. You guys are good. It's actually a spittle bug, so that is the correct answer. So they're these little small insects that are in the larva stage. So if it's in a larva stage, it's going to have complete metamorphosis, which means it's going to have a chewing type of a mouth part of some sort. And so to protect itself, as it's feeding on the leaves of those plants, somehow or another, and maybe Tamara could explain it in detail at some point if you're really interested, it somehow or another releases this foamy white material around itself to try to protect it. Spittle bugs are kind of interesting. They're not really prolific in Missouri. We do see them from time to time, but they really don't cause a true infestation. If they do, let your master gardener coordinator know, because then their habitat or their growth might be changing in some capacity. And as we all know, we have survival of the fittest. So it's always good to let us know if you're starting to see things on an ongoing common basis that's not normal. Yeah, it does like basil. It also likes asparagus, if I'm not mistaken. What's going on here with this tomato plant? It's hard to see their soil here, but if you notice, there's browning, marginal, necrosis is what we're calling this. Necrosis means kind of death. And so the edges of these leaves are turning brown. What might be the issue with this tomato plant? Okay, it's going to go back to the question of what's actually occurred with this plant, where we ask the questions. This is weather shock. So what happened with this particular plant, and you notice, I was going to say probably all of the plants here. And again, we have to say, was it just this one tomato plant, or did it happen on all of the tomato plants, or the majority of those tomato plants, where we're seeing the brown necrosis on the leaves? And so what happened is the weather, you start your seeds indoors, you're getting those nice seedlings, are getting tall, it's turning nice, you want to get into the garden, you plant it on a really nice day, and maybe a day or two later, the temperature drops and it goes down in the evening to like 40 degrees or 45 degrees. And that is a huge shock from going to like nice 80 degrees down to about 40 to 45 degrees, 50 degrees. And especially when they're young and they've only been in the ground for a short period of time, we can see things that occur. Now, because the plant is young and because we know better growing conditions are going to happen for this warm season vegetable, we know that that plant is actually going to outgrow it. I've got lots of additional types of pictures here, and I've only got like about 5 minutes left. So I am going to go on a little bit further. If you're interested in all these pictures that I have and all the slides, feel free to go ahead and email me, and I'm happy to send you a PDF and you can see them all in color and see what all the different issues there are here. But what I wanted to do in the last few minutes is we do have the plant diagnostic lab on our campus. And so what you can do is you can get a hold of Dr. Pong Tian. There's his email and phone number. Here is the web address for the plant diagnostic lab. And then he has some great information on that particular website with pictures, descriptions of what's going on with those plants and those sorts of things. He can help to ID weeds. He can also help to identify different types of insects that might be occurring. You can also contact any of your horticulture specialists that are across the state. Here's a map of all of us. You might, if you're in a county where it might be open, such as up in the Northeast, Marion, Shelby, Monroe, Rawls, Pike, Audrain, that horticulture position is open at this particular point in time. But don't fret, get a hold of any one of us that are on the right side over here. We're always happy to help everyone, to answer your questions and to try to figure out what might be happening with your plant. And I'll leave this up for just a minute or two. Dave, were there any questions that came in after I stopped and closed my chat box?
There was only one, and it questioned whether that cold shock to the tomato, there might have been something in the soil. Perhaps they were alluding to potassium deficiency. I don't know, but that was the only thing that came in.
Okay, and so you're a tomato specialist in my mind. With it being a new particular small plant like that.
It would not show that yet because potassium is a mobile element, and it would not be moving it out at that stage.
And that's what I would think, but you're the expert, so I'm always going to refer back to you. Again, if you want to pick a PDF of all my slides, I'm happy to email that to you. Up on the screen is my email address right there, kellyd@missouri.edu. And I'm going to be on for the next presentation. So if you've got comments or questions, by all means, feel free to put them into the chat box. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Debbie, for that very informative presentation. Just as an aside, I teach 2 sections of online Master Gardener training, and I know that a lot of our trainees become discouraged about their ability to someday diagnose problems that people bring to them. And practice makes perfect. That's about all we can say. It's something that's in time achieved, but attending events like this, even virtually, are good ways to learn what to look for. Debbie mentioned sign versus symptoms. And you always have the network of the extension horticulturists around the state. So don't get discouraged. It will become easier with time, but it is a daunting task when somebody brings you in just a leaf and asks what's wrong.